Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll find out how drug companies are getting dangerous drugs on the market without any FDA approval. Our nation's poor, well, they're under attack from corporate America, and we'll tell you how groups like ALEC are helping to keep wages low for millions of workers. And the wealthy elite, well, they've gamed the system to the point that we're subsidizing them for doing absolutely nothing. We'll bring you the details on that story. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you just stepped in to the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Right-wing organizations like ALEC and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have managed to get laws passed all over this country to strip workers of their rights. Their biggest victory was preventing any change to existing minimum wage laws, and I have newspaper publisher Rick Outzen with me now to talk about what's happening. Rick, ALEC in the news more these days. We're finding out more and more about this disgusting, evil little gaggle of just conservative nuts the more we dig. The story, of course, is part of the story. There's so much to this story, but now we're finding out that in the 11 states where Republicans, took the House, they took governorships, they took across the board sweep where Republicans took control: Michigan, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Florida, all the regular suspect places, Texas. We now see that ALEC has a strategy where they put together a series of bills about the same thing, but they put it according to what the gag reflex of the legislators are. For example, they may go to a place like Florida and they may say, we want to completely abolish minimum wage. And there may be enough of a response to that where they say, no, we can't do that. But then the next step is to say, well, then let's just block any new minimum wages going forward. And they give, it's kind of like giving those Republican, conservative, and now Democrat legislators a choice on how disgusting they choose to be. Isn't that the new strategy here?
It is. What they do, Mike, is they create templates for all the legislatures from all across the country, and they have their target states. They go to Texas, they go to Wisconsin, they go to Pennsylvania, they come into Florida, and they gather the lawmakers, about 2,000 a year, to some big plush resort, and they pass out, these are the bills, which one of these do you want to put under your name in your legislature? And it really, it's happening so systematically that there's no doubt that this group is trying to control every state legislature in the country.
Well, and they're succeeding in that they're saying at least the 11 states that we know are just completely have no interest in protecting the rights of middle class or working poor, have every interest in putting more billions into the pockets of billionaires. But let's recap. What have they done? Let's just go down the list, starting with what they've done, not just with state employees, but now they started their attack on state employees, and everybody thought, well, this is just about teachers and firemen and policemen and doesn't really affect me because I'm not a state employee. How has that progressed even in the last year and a half?
Well, they've gone after the private sector. They've talked about right-to-work laws. They've tried to, in the state of Florida last year, they passed a bill where local governments can pass no ordinances involving paid sick leave. They've created these preemptive bills to prevent local government from dealing with it. But they've stretched out into the private sector, looked at trying to do away with battling the minimum wage laws, lifting restrictions on child labor, everything that they could think of, but using the heart of it. What started in Wisconsin with Scott Walker when he initially went after the public sector workers and the teachers, and it's just ballooned from there, Mike. But it started there.
Yeah, it started there, and then you had even in Wisconsin, for example, you had union members who were not, they weren't public employees, and they thought, well, gee, this doesn't
Right.
involve me, so they didn't get out and make sure that Scott Walker was bumped out of office on the recall. They did nothing about it. And now the irony is that the Scott Walker crowd is coming after them. The truth is, they've always been going after them. And it's not, look, you're seeing these ALEC bills that are coming through that are being paid for by the crazy right. I mean, the really organized crazy right, who I'm going to name here in just a minute. People you should not be, you really should not be buying products from a list of people that I want to talk about here. But first of all, it's about overtime. They want to do away with any kind of overtime rights. They want to do away with sick leave. They want to do away with workplace safety. They want to make it harder for an employee to sue an employee for sex discrimination. They want to change child labor laws. They want to change the law that says that if an employer steals wages from you in wage theft, which they do constantly these days, that you don't have any rights. Now, the irony, and I guess it is kind of chickens come home to roost, is that the private unions didn't think it was going to affect them, did they?
Right. No, they took no solidified, solid approach to fighting this, and it is coming home. You know, the battle over government pensions that we've seen over the last couple of years. Now we're going to see that move into the private sector. The private sector, I bet, 5 years from there, Mike, we're not going to be seeing hardly any pension plans out there. There'll all be 401ks, or there'll be some sort of weird concoction that helps Wall Street, but there won't be what we see in pensions now. We will not see 5 and 10 years from now. And
so this started out with, again, it was misdirection. It was just absolute stupidity on part of the American public. And in their defense, it is because the corporate media never really told the story of where this was going. It was going to private unions. We want to bust private unions. Listen, here it is. Who are the people behind this? Let me name some names. Who are the people that pump up ALEC? How about this? The next time you're at Walmart, understand they put huge money into taking your right as a worker away. FedEx, Exxon, Amway, the tobacco companies, the pharmaceutical companies. You have a responsibility, I think, if you're watching this program, to say, why do you do business with these people? Why would you buy Amway knowing that they're doing everything they can to attack America's middle class and America's working poor so they can make another dime for their multi-billion-dollar CEO? That's what's happening. So we can either choose to say, well, we're not going to do anything about it, or you can actually show your disfavor by doing something immediately. Don't shop at Walmart. Don't buy Amway. Don't buy Exxon. Don't buy Coca-Cola. This is easy stuff, isn't it?
It is, and I think the other thing that needs to happen in this next election cycle is the voters need to ask people, are you a member of ALEC? Do you go to ALEC meetings? We've started doing it with our newspaper because I think the public has a right to know. We know that some of these bills, some of these lawmakers can barely read. There's no way that they could draft complicated bills involving government pension reform or dealing with child labor law or half a dozen things that are out there. And we need to identify it. Their membership is secretive, Mike. We don't know who their members
Rick,
are.
you joke. I know you're not joking about they can barely read and they can barely comprehend, because you interview.
I'm in Florida.
you interview them constantly, though. That's what you do as an investigative journalist. And it's the same thing I see now, is the dumbing down of just the pure intellect of the teabag Republican legislators that were swept in this last big teabag movement. Well, now, here are the parts of it. First of all, the sweep took place because of the teabag movement to some degree.
Right.
But the second part of it was Citizens United, correct? And the third part of it was that ALEC had been out there just waiting for the right time. And then ALEC made the decision that now is the right time because we have 11 states that we can build around, to where we create a policy in those 11 states that the federal government starts applying. And now we're seeing that already, aren't we? We're moving into January and February, where we're going to see the federal legislators take away rights for the middle class and the working poor. Isn't that kind of, and we look at the ALEC plan, we see that this is what they had planned all along, and now it's coming to the surface.
You're right, and it has been a timeline that's been used, Mike, because in the early days of ALEC, all they would do, FedEx and Walmart and the Florida Chamber and the U.S. Chamber, they would pay for these conferences. Educational conferences is what they called them. And gradually over time, that became the big draw to bring all these people in, that they've got wined and dined, didn't have to report it to anybody. We never knew what was said in it. And they just started testing a little bit here, a little bit there, but now they actually control all the states that you mentioned, and it is going it's going both directions, Mike, what I see, and this is what bothers me. It's moving up into the federal level, but they're passing laws at the state level that restrict what local governments can do if they wanted to make their community safer. In the state of Florida, they can't regulate guns in their cities and counties. It's a $100,000 a day fine. Now they can't do anything to help employment.
Ultimately, what ALEC is designed to do, Rick, as we learn more and more about them, is they're designed to facilitate money between the huge money donors, the Walmarts and the Exxons and the Coca-Cola types, and then facilitate money between them and the legislator that they choose as their chosen guy or woman. And then they're the people, they're the go-between for that money. And you explain how they do that, and how does that happen?
Well, what they end up doing was they sponsor the seminars, the training. They actually draft the bills for the lawmakers. So if you make a donation to ALEC, you're going to get the bill that you want. And that is just almost, it creates this rift there that the public is not involved in any way in the process. Citizens United, then you add that on top of it, Mike, then they can all of a sudden start donating directly to the campaigns, but not make it look like it's about laws to benefit themselves. They got ALEC working on the back end for them on that.
Rick, have we moved so far? Has the plight, you write about this a lot, I understand, and I want to ask you, has the plight of America's middle class and working poor moved so far out of control that we can't reverse it? I mean, don't you feel like that? Don't you feel like you're looking at a game where the other side has 50 points going into the game?
All right, we're pushing rope up a hill. That's how it seems sometimes. But I'm an optimist. I'm hoping that as each election cycle comes through, that we can get a few more of the honest people elected. We need a Teddy Roosevelt. We need somebody that's from that Republican class that realizes that they're killing this country. They're destroying our democracy. We need someone to speak up.
And now we really can't day to day. I don't know that we can even count on the majority of Democrats to give us that kind of relief.
Right.
Rick Outzen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mike.
When we come back, we'll find out why the wealthiest Americans are being subsidized by the federal government. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. America has become a welfare state, but not in the way Republicans want you to think about that. We hand out billions of dollars in corporate welfare every year. We cut back on aid to those who need the money, and instead we give it to multi-billionaire corporations. Joining me now to talk about this is author Les Leopold. Les Leopold is the author of the book, How to Make $1 Million an Hour. Les, 16 million children in America living in poverty, and in the same breath we call ourselves that exceptional nation. What's wrong with this picture?
Well, it tells us we're exceptionally cruel. Through deliberate policy, we've allowed nearly 1/4 of our children to live in poverty, while we're allowing our billionaire class, 442 of them, to basically make money by going to sleep at night and waking up in the morning through hundreds and hundreds of different passive investments, which are not taxed.
We've been talking about poverty. You've been talking about poverty. I've been talking about poverty for 15 years, at least by way of these kind of vehicles, broadcast vehicles. I'm convinced that the problem is getting worse almost geometrically. What is your take on it?
Well, it actually has gotten incredibly worse since the 2008 crash. 95, we're supposedly in a recovery. 95% of that recovery has gone to the top 1%. Childhood poverty has gone up by 4%. The average wage has not gone up at all for the 99%. How are we allowing this to happen? This is not an act of God. This is the act of deliberate policy. You know, we rank last amongst developed nations in childhood poverty. Finland is number one. It's a matter of policy, and we've decided that it's okay to be cruel.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, and it's almost become an acceptable part of our culture. Certainly, it is in the Beltway. We just see they cut $47 million off of food stamps at the same time that they gave more subsidies to corporate farmers. Interesting note. The $350 billion is the net worth of 50 of the largest corporate farmers in the world, in the United States, doing business. We're giving them subsidies, and at the same time cutting $47 million away from food stamps.
That's right. Some of those 442 billionaires are actually getting subsidies from the same farm bill that's cutting food stamps. But I think we have to dig even deeper here, because both parties have already agreed in the future to make even more cuts. We're talking about the Democrats are willing to cut $4 billion. The Republicans want to cut $40 billion over the next 10 years, and that's going to go to conference, and they're going to be discussing how much to cut. So I'm asking myself, what happened? I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I used to think the Democratic Party had a plan to eradicate poverty. Matter of fact, even the Republicans did. They had a guaranteed annual income that Milton Friedman put forth. What happened to that? Now we don't even have the remotest talk about eliminating poverty. Instead, we're cutting food.
One thing we saw happening, Les, and by the way, I said 47 million, it's $47 billion that was cut from food stamps. You know, with numbers flying around, cuts to entitlements nowadays, they get bigger and bigger, so it's startling. But one thing we saw happening is we saw Lyndon Baines Johnson was the first Democrat to really invest into America's middle class and working poor. If you really think about it, what ended up happening is you had Democrats in the red states that said, gee, I can't be part of that. But what ended up happening, Les, and I think you've written about this, is the void was filled by the Wall Street billionaire crowd, the intellectual types who said, gee whiz, I can't buy into right-wing racism of the Republican Party, therefore I'm going to stick with the Democrats. And so Wall Street became really the base of the Democratic Party. These, you know, it seems every year, it started with Bill Clinton in a serious kind of way, and it's progressed more and more to where Cory Booker, for example, is now considered an acceptable Democrat, even though he's wholly owned and operated by Wall Street. What do you see? Where do you see this story going? I mean, we're looking January and February, the big fights. America's middle class and working poor are going to lose again, aren't they?
They are, because the Democratic Party can take all of us, millions of progressives across the country, take us entirely for granted because we have no place else to turn. There is no credible threat to the Democratic Party coming from the progressive side. So to get more votes, it's naturally going to drift to the right, and it's got its corporate and Wall Street backers that are pushing it that way. So all the talk, I mean, this is insane. We're talking about cutting back the social safety net because Wall Street crashed the economy and we had to bail them out.
Right, okay.
So we're paying for the bailouts by tightening everybody's belt, and the Democratic Party's just drifting with it. Their claim to fame is, we're not going to cut it as much as the Republicans.
Yeah, and as you say, you have to follow us because we're your only option. That's the big problem. That's the huge problem. But as we see this developing, I'm interviewing more and more people that have the real belief that the Democrats, the Koch brother kind of money, the real conservative dark money that's moving from dark money campaign to dark money campaign is actually ending up in the hands of Democrats who are more Wall Street Democrats who are running against more moderate Democrats. We're seeing that in races. I interviewed somebody last week about the idea that the Democrat they're running against is wholly owned by AT&T, and his suspicion is that dark money is actually coming from money that we would traditionally say is going to go from conservative Koch brother money to Republicans. Now it's moving to Democrats because they're so, you have that big money crowd so comfortable with the idea that Democrats have abandoned the working poor and the middle class.
Right. What we basically need is an alternative to the Tea Party. Professor Sheldon Wolin describes this as fugitive politics, where politics takes to the streets. We're going to have to go in that direction. You know, Occupy Wall Street was headed in the right direction. It's a shame that it wasn't able to develop into a broader populist movement. Look, you know your history as well as I do. The populist movement of the 1880s and 1870s was incredibly powerful. It revamped America. It led to a progressive tradition that controlled runaway corporate power and put pressure on Wall Street. Unless we build some kind of movement like that has progressive teeth, we are going to be basically the prey for the rest of our lives. We're going to be like, it's going to be like debt peonage. We're going to be picking up the tab for Wall Street successes again and again and again. The distribution of income between the top and the bottom is going to get worse. Poverty is going to increase. And it's not going to, the wealth is not going to trickle down until we fight for it. No one's going to give it to us.
Les, isn't part of the problem what we've seen, and we're continuing to see it. We see Obama, for example, jumping behind TPP, which is something that makes NAFTA and CAFTA look like a cakewalk. It's so draconian. But what we see is organized corporate entities that are saying, let's create job scarcity in America to the point to where 10 people have to fight for one job, 20 people have to fight for one job, and then they're going to accept whatever the hell we give them. We're seeing it in the fast food business right now, where you have companies like McDonald's that we're having to subsidize. I mean, we taxpayers having to subsidize the people working at McDonald's because McDonald's doesn't even pay a wage that people can live on. But in the old days, we would see corporations go to places like South Africa or Saipan or India because they could get cheap labor there. Now we have in place in the United States an effort to create poverty, or the threat of poverty so severe that there's a job scarcity where you have 20 people vying for the same job, and the employer says, you know what, I'm not going to give you pension, I'm not going to give you sick leave, I'm not going to give you insurance, and if you're not happy with that, get out of line and let the next person step up. Don't you see that happening in an organized fashion right now in the United States?
I do. I put the organized fashion, an accent slightly different. I agree with exactly what you said, but I think it's the result of a war between financialism and what we used to think of as capitalism. Wall Street has figured out how to basically grab every income stream in the country. Any productive corporation that they can get their hands on, what they do is they load it up with debt. They then squeeze the workforce, reduce as many workers as possible, rob their pension funds, speed up the work. They've done this to thousands and thousands of corporations. That was that was the secret of Bain Capital, of Romney fame. And what they're going to do also with the federal government is the same thing. They're going to force privatization so they can get their hands on the income stream, be it Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, and then that enriches them. They then get the interest payments, enormous amounts of interest payments, asset inflation, that the assets that they own. The rest of us are going to be in struggling, collapsing corporations.
And to land this, Les, what this does is perpetuates exactly what we started out with. It perpetuates poverty to where we're calling ourselves a nation of exceptionalism when we have 16 million children that are living in poverty. I know you saw the number. 1 in 5 families said that sometime in the past year they've had to do without food. Les Leopold, thank you for what you turn out. It's great stuff. It's stuff that keeps us informed about how bad things have potential to get if we don't do something about it. Les Leopold, thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll find out why the FDA signed off on a drug that they knew would kill patients. Unbelievable as it is, it's true. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back. Hi, I'm Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. The corporate-controlled media rakes in millions of dollars in profit every year by only telling you half of the story. They're at the mercy of their corporate sponsors, and they refuse to take on corporations that kill, maim, and harm consumers. Here at Free Speech TV, we don't have shareholders. We don't answer to corporate America, and we don't pull any punches. Our loyalty is to the viewers, and our viewers are the ones that help keep Free Speech TV alive. Free Speech TV doesn't take corporate money, and that's why your financial support is so important to us. Viewer voices, not corporate sponsors, fuel Free Speech TV and drive many of our programming decisions. You can help protect Free Speech TV with your donation. Free Speech TV airs independent news and views for independent thinkers like you. Our people-powered programs demonstrate what's possible in our democracy when we unite as workers, as students, as artists, as parents, and partners in progress. More people means more power. Each donation brings more power and programs and more possibilities for change. Our programming equips viewers with vital tools, resources, contacts, and examples of how to collectively build alternative, sustainable solutions to serious community problems. Please donate now and bring these organizing tools into your community. Everyone should have access to news and information that's forming the world around them. Our goal is to keep you and everybody involved. We aim to reach every viewer possible because we're all in this together. Go online to freespeech.org and help support independent, honest news journalism. Your support helps keep information flowing, and together we can hold the corporate media more accountable. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The FDA has become so dysfunctional that they're almost completely useless at this stage. When they were presented with evidence of the drug Pradaxa's potential to kill people, they signed off on it anyway. Joining me to talk about this is attorney Ned McWilliams. It seems like almost every week, Ned, we hear another story about the FDA dropping the ball, not doing their job, as an agency that's become wholly dysfunctional. Well, this new story about Pradaxa is very, very troubling. Lay it out for us.
Yeah, it is, Pap. Basically, we have this drug that we don't need, and as of the last reports, the last figures, there's been over anywhere between 15,000 and 150,000 people who have bled to death on this drug Pradaxa. And the issue is, and again, as you pointed out, it's the FDA. The FDA has dropped the ball. And the problem is that the FDA was in such a hurry to approve this drug that they quit doing their job. They forgot their job. And they basically broke all their own rules. They let this drug get approved with one study when traditionally you have to have two studies. They normally make you do double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. Here, they did something called open label, which means the investigator and the patients knew what drug they were on. So of course there's bias there. And they did fast-track approval and priority review drugs for a process that's traditionally reserved for new AIDS drugs or new cancer drugs. This is not an AIDS drug or cancer drug. This is for atrial fibrillation, a very common ailment.
It's an unnecessary drug. I mean, let's begin there. You have another drug, warfarin, that does exactly the same thing, only you don't bleed to death and die when you take warfarin if it's done right.
That's exactly right.
Here you bleed to death and die, and while you're dying on the table, the company has nothing to stop the bleeding with. They have no antidote at all. And the FDA knew that. The FDA said, well, you don't need an antidote. Just let people bleed to death. But what's interesting to me is now you have scientists and doctors and hospitals looking at the way the FDA approved this drug, and they're saying basically what a disaster.
That's right. There's what I'd call a growing chorus of doctors and experts that say we need to do an independent audit, an independent review of this clinical trial that served as the basis for approval of this drug, because nobody's believing it now. Because like I said, they had this one clinical trial that makes the drug look good, but now in the real life, in the real world, thousands and thousands of people are bleeding to death, and doctors are saying this enough is enough. We need to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, the makers of Pradaxa come out and say, well, gee whiz, you know, people bleed to death, people bleed from warfarin. The difference is they don't bleed to death on warfarin.
That's
five
right.
times the number of people that take warfarin and take Pradaxa, 5 times the number of people taking Pradaxa are going to bleed to death because there's no way to stop it. Now, who's getting this? I mean, your mothers, your fathers, your grandparents. This is a drug that is sold in a large part to elderly. For what? Why is that?
That's right. It's a drug for atrial fibrillation, which is a very common ailment. 2 to 3 a million Americans have atrial fibrillation, and you're right. The overwhelming majority of those patients are over 75. Overwhelming majority of the Pradaxa patients are over 80, and those are the patients at the highest risk of bleeding to death. And those are exactly the patients who shouldn't be on this drug.
Well, you had Pradaxa and the manufacturers of Pradaxa come in and say, gee whiz, you know, this is a great, and by the way, the company, let's put the cards on the table. It's Boehringer Ingelheim, which is a German company. We know just across the board that what they've done is they've unloaded this drug here in America because they make more money selling the drug in America than they do in other countries. Because
That's right.
in America, they can game the system and make almost twice as much selling it in America as they can in Canada or Japan or even Germany for that matter. So they're unloading this poisonous drug here in America, and people that are taking it are at risk of dying in what way? Tell me what you've seen with this drug.
Well, it's these situations, and you see these case reports for some of the most startling case reports where people who took one single pill bleed to death. There's a very famous report in the literature of an 81-year-old gentleman who took one pill and bled to death. There's also these stories you hear of, like you keep talking about, how there's no reversal agent, where people will have a very simple trauma, like they'll stub their toe or have a nosebleed, and people are literally bleeding to death from nosebleeds and from stubbed toes. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. And it's in the literature.
Tell me who the ISMP is. Tell the viewers what the ISMP is, and tell them what the ISMP found when they did their job after the FDA failed to do their job.
The ISMP is the Institute for Safe Medicine Practice, and they put out a publication every quarter called Quarter Watch, where they look at adverse event reports, which is where doctors and patients tell the FDA or tell a drug company, look, there's this bad stuff happening whenever someone takes your drug. And what they did was they looked at not just the numbers, but they looked at the nature of the events of patients who are on warfarin, who are on Pradaxa, or even some of these other newer drugs like Xarelto or Eliquis. And what they found was that the patients on Pradaxa, if you suffered a bleed, and they looked at people on warfarin and the people who suffered bleeds on Pradaxa, and they found that the Pradaxa patients were 5 times more likely to die as a result of that bleed. So it's not a matter, some people like to say, well, it's the new drug and that's why it's being reported new. It's not the number of events that's so high, it's the nature. It's like you said, people bleed on warfarin, people bleed on Pradaxa, but you're much more likely to die as a result of a bleed on Pradaxa, and that's the problem.
Well, first of all, Boehringer Ingelheim has claimed that this drug is their cash cow. So as their cash cow, we can bet on one thing, and that is the FDA will continue not doing their job because of the influence of industry. The revolving door of industry is going to have a huge impact here, isn't it?
That's absolutely correct. If you look at the individuals involved in this particular case, I can tell you that they all are former industry workers. The point person at the FDA who's responsible for overseeing this particular drug, Pradaxa, she used to work at Merck, the company that's famous for the major Vioxx disaster.
Yeah, Ned, the truth is, until some people are arrested and prosecuted for this type of crime, and it is a crime, to allow this to happen, we're not going to see any difference in the United States, I'm afraid. Ned McWilliams, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Pat.
Poverty wages affect every American citizen because we end up having to pay to help support workers who aren't paid a living wage by their employers. Joining me to explain how that happens is attorney Howard Nations. Howard, it's pretty amazing. Most people don't understand that, that they are actually subsidizing Big Macs and Burger Kings all over the country. Tell us this story about how these corporations are passing on their lack of decency to taxpayers.
Well, what they're doing, Mike, is through the minimum wage, which they hold on to dearly with their Republican lapdogs in Congress. The minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. There are 4 million people on that. And that's 40-hour week is less than $1,000 a month, which is not even enough for basic shelter. The average one-bedroom apartment in this country costs $1,091. So they're not even providing basic shelter. And the substantial number of the fast food workers, according to a study that just came out last week, are receiving public assistance. As a matter of fact, 52% of the fast food workers are receiving public assistance in the form of food stamps or Medicaid, as opposed to 25% of the regular workforce. So how do they survive? Through the tax subsidy. We are paying, the taxpayers are paying $7 billion a year to the fast food industry, supplementing the income of their employees. That's how it works.
Well, it's a story that's just as ugly as us supplementing the oil industry to the tune of $40 billion, or the factory farmers to the tune of $1 billion. It just is another one of those stories that that unless you understand the mechanics of it, you don't understand that, yeah, these people are getting jobs, but they're getting jobs in ways that McDonald's or Burger King or any of the fast food companies can squeeze every dime, not out of just them, but out of the taxpayers as well. And so now this story's coming forward a little bit. I'm still not really seeing it in corporate media reporting how ugly this story is. But look, at this point, the idea of supporting a family on $1,000 a month, and here's where everybody misses this. This isn't just about high school kids in looking for jobs. What's happened is our economy is so bad, you have elderly that can't even make ends meet in the retirement days. You have mothers and fathers, single parents, that are working 2 and 3 jobs. One of those jobs typically is in a fast food kind of setting. So this affects all of us. We're subsidizing all of that from McDonald's, aren't we?
McDonald's is the prime example. Their profits in 2012 were $6 billion. The supplement that they got through this system of us financing their employees was $1.2 billion, 20% of their profits. So the taxpayers are subsidizing fast food industry, who are major contributors to the obesity problem in this country, which in turn is a major cause of health care cost, which gets passed back to taxpayers. Very vicious circle where the taxpayer loses at any point on the circle.
You know, Howard, don't you think it's interesting that you don't have the Tea Party out complaining about this? They're the people who want to do something about our deficit, or the Republican right-wing conservative nuts that are always talking about how bad the deficit is. And here we have tax money driving up the deficit, don't we?
Yep, it's really amazing, because what's happening here, there are 3 things that we know are true. That there's a positive correlation right now between the real minimum wage, which has fallen since 1969. The true minimum wage has buying power of the people receiving it has fallen. At the same time, food stamps have increased. Then you have the wages of the as a percentage of gross domestic product are at a near all-time low, while corporate profits as a percentage of gross domestic product are at a near all-time high. So this raises, and the big issues in America right now are weak job markets and high government spending. Now you would think that the Republicans would be all over this, because it involves subsidies, it involves the things that they absolutely hate. It involves food stamps, it involves anybody receiving anything free from the government, except that this is corporate welfare. And corporate welfare flows right back into their political campaigns. And so they just don't find themselves that concerned about it. However, they were willing to cut the money going to the recipients. They voted this year to cut by unanimous vote of the Republicans in the House, they voted to cut $39 billion out of the food stamp program, and they voted against a $9 minimum wage.
Well, it's just the same analysis we use for an oil company. First of all, is this company, this healthy, ridiculously healthy company, do they really need federally funded money by way of taxpayer subsidies? And that's what's happening here. And really, if the congressional Republicans are serious about this whole deficit thing, why are they allowing more tax money to go to subsidize these companies indirectly? And the reason is that it's not a real economic argument about taxes and the budget. It's ideology. In about 20 seconds, what's your thought on that?
Well, it's not just McDonald's, and let me tell you that the next time you hear a fast food chain CEO standing up talking about government spending and small government and supporting Republican candidates and making big contributions, there are a number of those, if you'll notice, in the fast food industry. What you're seeing is hypocrisy on steroids. So the Republicans are in favor, it's corporate welfare, yes, living minimum wage, no, and
corporate welfare at an all-time high. This is just another example, isn't it, Howard?
It really is.
Howard
really
Nations,
is.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mike.
When we come back, we'll take a look at how dysfunctional the FDA has become. We'll be right back. Stay with us right here on Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The FDA is supposed to help keep dangerous drugs off the market, but since that can hurt Big Pharma's bottom line, they've found ways to get around that. Joining me now to talk about this is attorney Mike Burg. Michael, news story out there about generic drugs. Scarier by the minute. We're finding now that in India, they're not even doing a fraction of what they need to do as far as research and testing to put the drug on the market as a generic. Lay the story out for us.
Well, it has to do with one of the largest manufacturers of generic drugs, Ranbaxy, which has they really have manufacturing plants in India, but all throughout the world. And what's amazing about it is that one of their chief executives, Mr. Thacker, began to give his son a generic drug as an antibiotic, and his son wasn't getting better, and he couldn't figure it out. What happened was he then gave him the non-generic, and his son got better, and he began to investigate as to whether or not the antibiotic was in fact bioequivalent or had the same compound, and he found out it didn't. And he continued to do investigations, and he found out they were just phoning up their studies and selling these drugs as if they were the same, and they weren't. And he ended up being the whistleblower in this incredible case.
Okay, so in other words, we're seeing it with American drug companies. Let's just be clear. We're seeing it with American drug companies where they phony up the underlying clinicals. They don't report the clinicals like they're supposed to. There's a requirement that they report the clinicals. They're not doing that. But here, this is you had a whistleblower that said that the FDA, where generics are concerned, are virtually doing nothing. I mean, that's how strong this language was. The FDA is doing nothing to ensure that generics are even created in compliance with the formulation of the original drug. In other words, you could have one of these companies in India, for example, that's not even including all the necessary ingredients because they're trying to cut corners, and then they're selling that generic drug to the American public. Did that get it right?
Exactly. And what's more fascinating and what should really, really be scary for the American public is that while the FDA was investigating Ranbaxy, and telling them that they couldn't sell these drugs until they were able to prove that they did have the right ingredients. Another arm of the FDA was allowing them to manufacture the generic for Lipitor, in which that company then made over $1 billion selling Lipitor at the same time.
Now let me get this right. Office down the hall at FDA is saying we're looking at a corrupt company that is maybe not even putting all the ingredients in the generic that they're selling in America. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. Company down the hall from that guy, also with the FDA, same building. They're actually doing business with the same company that's being investigated down the hall, so they can do more business in America with Lipitor. It's incredible, but that is the state of our FDA right now. If you don't believe it, just look at the Pradaxa case that we talked about earlier. Okay, well, let me ask you this: as this goes forward, we're actually seeing some of these generic companies that are having to plead guilty. Matter of fact, the company Pradaxa that you just talked about, they had to plead guilty to 7 felonies for doing that. But nevertheless, we're still doing government contract work with them. The FDA is still approving their drugs, and nothing really changes. Add to it, what happens in America when a generic drug kills somebody? What can the family about that? What can the family do about that if they lose a family member because a generic drug kills them?
Well, this is what's really just incredibly scary and horrible, is that under the Messing and the Bartlett decision from our Supreme Court, generic drug makers have immunity. So there's no reason for them to do anything right, because they can't be sued anymore. And so you've got this situation where it's not only, in my opinion, Ranbaxy, but I believe generics all over the world, including right here in the United States, they have no reason to make sure that these products have the proper ingredients, because they have no consequences. They cannot be sued. And when you tell the average person on the street, they say, well, that can't be right. But that is what we have here.
People don't believe that, but this is what they allowed to happen. This is what I had somebody in my office 2 weeks ago talking about the fact that they had lost a spouse from a drug that we knew clearly had the potential to. It's killing many people in the United States, but it was the generic, and they asked why we can't sue them. And we had to explain, well, because the Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices did not allow us to do that. And dig a little further, these were individuals who voted Republican their entire lives. So, I mean, there is, again, I've said it earlier, chickens come home to roost. Look, here is the other part of it. We in the past, we haven't really held these foreign generic companies accountable at all. We still are not holding them accountable. They could be selling you a drug that is supposed to be a life-saving chemotherapy drug, only to find that they haven't put all the ingredients in it because the ingredients were too expensive, and so there's no way at all for us to do anything about it for that person who dies because of the lack of chemotherapy. The other thing is they don't even have to publish in any kind of way that we can follow what their clinical trials are showing on that drug, do they?
No, they don't. And on the first part, Ranbaxy does make chemotherapy drugs, and Mr. Thacker, who was one of the top executives, said he would never use any of their drugs for anybody he knew. And so here's the other problem, is that they begin to do their clinical trials, whether it's a generic or whether it's a name manufacturer. Right now, when they cancel that study because there's adverse events, people are dying, people are getting hurt, they're basically then hiding that data, and they're not reporting it to the FDA, they're not reporting it to the public, and so it kind of just goes away, and they're able to secretly hide the data that clinical trial was showing all those adverse events. It's outrageous.
Well, Michael, if the government doesn't hold them accountable, the Justice Department doesn't hold them accountable. I mean, these people had to plead guilty to felonies, but nobody went to prison. And then now they can do this. They can come up with a phonied up generic product. They can sell it in the United States. It can kill 1,000 people. and nobody, and they have immunity from being sued. Is that the state? Is that really the state of the law right now?
Yes, it is. And sadly and unbelievably, that is the state of the law.
And as we watch the other part of it, one way that science and doctors can respond to a bad drug like Pradaxa, for example, or Vioxx, or Yaz, or Actos, or transvaginal mesh, many of these things that are out there on the market. One way that we can respond is we can find out, what does the clinical data show? How long has the product been on the market, and what does the clinical data show? Now we find out that 78 to 85%, somewhere in there, of these manufacturers, there is no data within the public domain that tells us how many people their drug is killing, how many people are having adverse reactions. What does the clinical data show? There is no way, because the Beltway idiots didn't come up with legislation that put teeth into anything to require that these Indian companies or these Chinese companies or these South American companies or these companies right here in the United States that are criminals, there's no requirement that they report their clinical data.
That is an absolute fact, and it is horrible for the American public, because when you start to look at that these criminal companies are killing people, it's all covered up. You can't even get the data to show that they knew when they did their clinical studies that this was going to happen.
Mike, the other thing we see happening because of this new mincing law, this new immunity that drug companies get when they kill you or a family member, they can't be sued, they can't be held responsible. We see these drug companies now going and taking primary drugs, the initial primary drug that was developed, that was taken off the market because it was so damn dangerous. These generic companies are now taking those primary drugs that were taken off the market, they're putting them into generic form and selling them that way. Isn't that something we should expect in about 30 seconds? Isn't that the way this whole business is headed?
It is, and when the American public understands that we now have this quote managed healthcare, 80% of the drugs we take are generic because our managed healthcare won't let us get those drugs that are made under the name brand. And so now we have this cloak of immunity. We've got the phony clinical trials. We got the wrong ingredients in there. Millions and millions of people in the United States are at risk today, and no one is doing anything about it because the thugs in Congress, the right wing, the Republicans, have basically allowed this to happen.
We've become, Michael, we've become a slave colony, and we are slaves to the pharmaceutical industry in so many ways. Michael Burg, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you, Mike.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire. Hi, I'm Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. The corporate-controlled media rakes in millions of dollars in profit every year by only telling you half of the story. They're at the mercy of their corporate sponsors, and they refuse to take on corporations that kill, maim, and harm consumers. Here at Free Speech TV, we don't have shareholders. We don't answer to corporate America, and we don't pull any punches. Our loyalty is to the viewers, and our viewers are the ones that help keep Free Speech TV alive. Free Speech TV doesn't take corporate money, and that's why your financial support is so important to us. Viewer voices, not corporate sponsors, fuel Free Speech TV and drive many of our programming decisions. You can help protect Free Speech TV with your donation. Free Speech TV airs independent news and views for independent thinkers like you. Our people-powered programs demonstrate what's possible in our democracy when we unite as workers, as students, as artists, as parents, and partners in progress. More people means more power. Each donation brings more power and programs and more possibilities for change. Our programming equips viewers with vital tools, resources, contacts, and examples of how to collectively build alternative, sustainable solutions to serious community problems. Please donate now and bring these organizing tools into your community. Everyone should have access to news and information that's forming the world around them. Our goal is to keep you and everybody involved. We aim to reach every viewer possible because we're all in this together. Go online to freespeech.org and help support independent, honest news journalism. Your support helps keep information flowing, and together we can hold the corporate media more accountable.